June 27, 1944, over Normandy, France, just after midnight. Allied forces held 43 prisoner collection points across the beachhead sector. Expected processing capacity, 200 prisoners per day. Actual intake by week 3, 817. The discrepancy appeared first in a logistics cable marked, quote, urgent resupply, medical. One line stood out in the morning briefing. German medical personnel, status unclear, detained pending verification. The words carried weight beyond their brevity. In war, uncertainty about identity meant uncertainty about everything else. Captain Henry Lawson read the report twice before stepping into the humid night air. The barracks perimeter felt different now. Something had shifted in the careful order of command. He could hear boots on wet gravel, the distant percussion of artillery, and beneath it all, the question that would not settle. Who decides what betrayal means when the lines blur? June 27, 1944, over Normandy, France, just after midnight. Allied forces held 43 prisoner collection points across the beachhead sector. Expected processing capacity, 200 prisoners per day. Actual intake by week 3, 817. The discrepancy appeared first in a logistics cable marked urgent resupply, medical. One line stood out in the morning briefing. German medical personnel, status unclear, detained pending verification. The words carried weight beyond their brevity. In war, uncertainty about identity meant uncertainty about everything else. Captain Henry Lawson read the report twice before stepping into the humid night air. The barracks perimeter felt different now. Something had shifted in the careful order of command. He could hear boots on wet gravel, the distant percussion of artillery, and beneath it all, the question that would not settle: who decides what betrayal means when the lines blur? Captain Henry Lawson stood in the pre-dawn cold of June 27, 1944, at 03:15, his boots planted in the mud outside the British POW collection facility 3 kilometers inland from Omaha Beach. The facility processed an average of 42 prisoners daily since D-Day. Tonight's intake had included one anomaly: his uniform pressed against his shoulders with the weight of rank and the damp Normandy air. The night patrol had gone smoothly. Too smoothly, he thought now. Peace always cracked first at the edges. Colonel Andrews sat behind a field desk inside the command hut, his fingers drumming a steady rhythm on a crumpled intelligence summary. The single oil lamp threw shadows across the page. "She's not just a nurse," Andrews said quietly. "German medical officer, Red Cross insignia, but the intelligence says otherwise." He tapped the paper. "We know their methods." Lawson's mind turned the words over. A German medical officer. The sign outside read, "Traitor," in rough handwriting. He had seen it tied to the post where she stood, hands bound, face pale in the half-light. The words stuck with him now, lodged somewhere between duty and doubt. Outside, wind rattled the wooden frames. The war continued its relentless rhythm. But Lawson felt something else beginning, an internal calculation that refused easy answers. Was she a piece in a larger strategy, or had something gone wrong in the machinery of accusation? He needed to know more than what the report assumed. The intelligence summary listed her unit designation, Sanitates Company 30221, attached to the 352nd Infantry Division. The division had been responsible for coastal defense near Omaha Beach. By June 27th, most of its personnel were killed, missing, or captured. She was one of 14 medical staff taken into Allied custody that week. 13 had been processed without incident. She was the exception. "I want to speak with her," Lawson said. Andrews looked up, his expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Carefully, Captain. We can't afford mistakes." Lawson nodded and stepped back into the night. Morning arrived with grey light and persistent drizzle. By 06s, Lawson walked the perimeter toward the post where the nurse remained secured. His boots crushed gravel with each step. The sound felt too loud in the quiet camp. Mosquitoes hummed in the damp air, and the humidity wrapped around him like a second uniform. The nurse stood motionless, her posture suggesting exhaustion but also something harder to name. Resilience, perhaps, or simply the habit of endurance. Her German Red Cross uniform was torn at the shoulder and stained with mud. The standard issue field grey showed signs of rough handling during capture. Her face bore the marks of 2 days without sleep. Lawson stopped 3 meters away. "Do you have a name?" His voice carried just far enough. She did not turn her head. Her gaze remained fixed on the middle distance, focused on nothing. Around them, the camp moved through its morning routine. Soldiers passed at intervals, their voices low, their glances brief. The sign, "Traitor," hung from a nail, driven into the post above her head. Lawson studied the handwriting. It was hasty, made with charcoal, the letters uneven. Someone had acted quickly, driven by certainty or anger, or both. He waited. Silence sometimes revealed more than questions. The nurse's breathing was steady despite her circumstances. Her hands, bound with standard rope, showed abrasions from struggling against the restraints. But her eyes, those were what held his attention. They did not plead or accuse. They simply watched, as if recording everything for some future accounting. "Why?" Lawson asked aloud, more to himself than to her. The question hung in the damp air between them. She did not respond. He had not expected her to. But he needed to begin somewhere, and questions were the only tool he had left. A guard approached from the left, his rifle slung across his back. "Sir, Major Havers requests your presence in the command hut." Lawson nodded once and turned away, the nurse's silence following him like an unanswered debt. By 08:30, the command hut felt smaller than its actual dimensions. Major Havers paced the length of the room, his boots striking the wooden floor in rhythmic intervals. 3 other officers sat along the wall: Lieutenant Morrison, Captain Dale, and Sergeant Wallace, the camp's senior interrogator. The air smelled of coffee, cigarette smoke, and tension. "She's a cog in the machine," Havers said, his voice rising slightly. "Nothing more than that. The Germans train their medical staff in intelligence gathering. We have documentation on their methods." He gestured toward a folder on the desk. "Standard procedure." Lawson stood near the table, his hand resting on its rough surface. The wood was scarred from years of use, probably salvaged from a local farmhouse. He listened to the murmurs around him, the competing theories about the nurse's presence and purpose. The arguments circled the same points: uniform, unit designation, timing of capture. "We can't afford to make an example without facts," Lawson said, breaking into the rhythm of Havers' pacing. "She's not just a soldier, she represents something. But we don't know yet if she's guilty of anything beyond being captured." Havers stopped mid-stride. "Look at her uniform, Lawson. Look at where she was found. 300 meters from a forward observation post, carrying medical supplies and a field radio. The radio alone is sufficient evidence." "Field radios are standard issue for medical units coordinating evacuations," Lawson replied. His voice remained level. "The 352nd used decentralized medical support. It's documented in their operational structure." The room fell quiet. Lieutenant Morrison shifted in his chair. Wallace, the interrogator, leaned forward. "Captain Lawson makes a point," Wallace said slowly. "We should establish facts before we establish guilt. Otherwise, we're guessing." Havers exhaled sharply. "This is war, gentlemen. We don't have the luxury of philosophical deliberation." but his voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. Lawson felt the shift, small but present. Doubt, once introduced, tended to spread. Colonel Andrews appeared in the doorway. "Continue the interrogation, but do it properly. I want a full report by 18. He disappeared before anyone could respond. By noon on June 27th, the temperature had climbed into the mid-70s. Heat pressed down on the camp, turning the air thick and still. Lawson was summoned to the rear holding area, a section of the camp separated by barbed wire and guarded by 2 privates. The nurse sat on the ground, her back against a wooden support beam. Her face showed new bruises, one along her jaw, another near her left eye. The bruises had not been there at dawn. Lawson felt something tighten in his chest. He turned to the nearest guard. "Who's been here?" The guard hesitated. "Sergeant Collins, sir, about an hour ago, said he was conducting preliminary questioning." Lawson made a mental note. Collins was not part of the interrogation team. He approached the nurse slowly, crouching to bring himself closer to her eye level. She looked up, meeting his gaze for the first time. Her eyes held no fear now, only a kind of exhausted defiance. "Traitor?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse, barely audible. The single word felt like an accusation thrown back at him. Lawson steadied himself. "Tell me what happened." He kept his tone neutral, neither demanding nor sympathetic. The nurse looked down at the dirt beneath her. When she spoke again, her words came slowly, each one measured. "I was ordered to assist, not by choice." She paused. "Not by choice," she repeated, as if the phrase needed emphasis to be believed. Silence settled between them. Lawson studied her posture, the way her shoulders curved inward, the slight tremor in her hands. Her story did not match the narrative Hivers had constructed. It did not match the sign above the post. It introduced something more complicated, the possibility of coercion. "Who gave the order?" Lawson asked. She shook her head. "It doesn't matter. You wouldn't believe me." "Try me." She looked at him again, searching his face for something. Sincerity, perhaps, or simply the willingness to listen. "Major Richter," she said finally. "Sanitätsdienst." He commanded medical operations for the division. The name meant nothing to Lawson yet, but he would find out. At 14 Bayeux, Sergeant Wallace joined Lawson in the interrogation room, a requisition storage shed with 2 chairs and a table. The nurse sat across from them, her hands now unbound, but a guard stationed outside the door. Wallace carried a folder containing what little intelligence they had on German Medical Corps operations in Normandy. Wallace was methodical. He asked about her training, her assignment history, her duties during the defense of the coastal sector. The nurse answered most questions directly, her voice gaining strength as the interrogation progressed. She had been trained at a military hospital in Stuttgart. She had served with Sanitätskompanie 3-221 since April 1944. Her duties included triage, field surgery assistance, and casualty evacuation coordination. "And Major Richter?" Wallace asked, his pen poised over his notebook. The nurse's expression shifted. Something flashed across her face that Lawson recognized as anger mixed with shame. Major Richter commanded medical operations, but his methods... She stopped, searching for words. "He was not bound by the conventions." Wallace leaned forward. "Explain." She took a breath. "He used medical staff for intelligence gathering, required us to question wounded prisoners under the pretense of treatment. Those who refused were reassigned to forward positions. Punishment duty." Her voice dropped lower. "Or worse." Lawson felt the pieces beginning to align. Coercion, moral compromise disguised as military necessity. The Red Cross insignia on her uniform suddenly carried different weight, Not protection, but camouflage for operations that violated the very conventions the symbol represented. Were you involved in questioning prisoners? Wallace asked. Yes. The admission came quickly, as if she had been waiting to confess. Twice. Both times under direct order from Richter. I had no choice. Wallace made note. Lawson watched her carefully. The bruises on her face, the exhaustion in her posture, the tremor in her voice. All of it suggested someone caught between systems she could not control. But that did not answer the central question. What had she done, and what had been done to her? Where is Richter now? Lawson asked. Dead, she said flatly. Artillery strike on June 11th. I saw it happen. The room went quiet. Evidence, Lawson thought, had just become much harder to verify. By 16:00, a new complication emerged. Lieutenant Morrison entered the command hut with urgent news. Lieutenant Harris, a British medic attached to the camp's medical section, had gone missing. He had last been seen at 13:30 near the supply depot. His absence was noted when he failed to appear for a scheduled briefing. Lawson felt the situation shifting beneath him like unstable ground. Harris was competent, reliable, and had served with distinction since the landing. His disappearance introduced a variable that could not be coincidence. Colonel Andrews convened an immediate meeting. I want a full search. Check the perimeter, the medical tents, every structure in the compound. He turned to Lawson. Could this be connected to your prisoner? Lawson considered the question. It's possible. Harris had access to the holding area. He treated the nurse's injuries yesterday. The timeline created uncomfortable possibilities. Sergeant Wallace spoke up. If Harris is involved, we need to know how deep this goes. One missing medic could mean compromised security. It could mean we've had an intelligence breach. The search began immediately. Soldiers moved through the camp in systematic patterns, checking tents, storage areas, and perimeter positions. Lawson returned to the holding area, this time bringing Wallace with him. The nurse looked up as they entered. Lawson noticed her expression change. Recognition, then something like concern. You know who I am, Lawson said, studying her reaction. I don't care about your past allegiances. I want to know where Harris is. For the first time, the nurse met his gaze with something beyond fear or exhaustion. Determination hardened her features. He's not one of yours, she said quietly. The words carried weight that went beyond their literal meaning. Explain, Wallace demanded. She hesitated, then spoke carefully. He came to me last night, after the others left. He asked questions, not medical questions, questions about unit positions, about German defensive preparations, about radio frequencies we used. She paused. He said he could help me, that he had connections. Lawson felt his stomach drop. A double agent, operating inside the camp, using his medical access as cover, the implications spread outward like cracks in glass. Where did he go? Lawson asked. I don't know, but he was afraid. He said something had gone wrong. At 18:30, the search concluded with a discovery that confirmed the worst. Lieutenant Harris was found unconscious in a drainage culvert 200 meters outside the camp perimeter. 2 privates carried him back on a stretcher. His uniform was torn, his face bloodied, and his right shoulder showed signs of a struggle. Defensive wounds, Wallace noted after a quick examination. Lawson stood over Harris as the camp doctor worked to stabilize him. The doctor, Captain Pearson, moved with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs and administering morphine. He'll live, Pearson said after several minutes, but he took a beating. This wasn't an accident. Harris regained consciousness 30 minutes later. His eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, then sharpening, as awareness returned. He saw Lawson standing beside the cot and tried to sit up. Pearson pushed him back down. "Don't move yet." Lawson pulled up a chair. "Talk to me, Harris." His voice was calm but carried the weight of command. Harris's face contorted. Pain, fear, and something else. Resignation, perhaps. "I didn't have a choice," he said, his voice rough. The same phrase the nurse had used. Lawson noticed the parallel. "Start from the beginning." Harris closed his eyes. 3 months ago, before the invasion, I was approached by someone claiming to represent a resistance network. They said they needed information, medical supply routes, casualty figures, troop movements through field hospitals. He paused, struggling with the words. They said it would help end the war faster. "But they weren't resistance," Lawson said. Harris shook his head. "German intelligence. I realized too late. By then, they had leverage. Letters I'd written, things I'd said. They threatened to expose me as a collaborator unless I continued." His voice broke slightly. "I couldn't stop." Lawson felt the pieces falling into final alignment. Harris had been compromised, used. When the nurse was captured and her connection to Richter's intelligence operations came to light, Harris had panicked. He had tried to silence her, or escape, and failed. "Who attacked you?" Wallace asked from the doorway. Harris's eyes moved toward the sergeant. "I don't know. Someone in the camp. Someone who knew what I was doing." He looked back at Lawson. "I'm sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing." Lawson stood. The right thing. In war, that phrase lost meaning fast. By 21 the camp had settled into uneasy quiet. Harris was secured in a separate holding area under guard. The nurse remained where she was, but her status had shifted from suspect to witness. The sign, "Traitor," had been removed from the post. Lawson had done that himself, pulling the nail free and letting the charcoal-marked board fall to the ground. Colonel Andrews convened a final briefing in the command hut. Present were Lawson, Wallace, Havers, Morrison, and Captain Pearson. The atmosphere was heavy with the weight of revelation and consequence. "Harris will face court-martial," Andrews said without preamble. "The evidence is clear. He compromised camp security, provided intelligence to the enemy, and attempted to obstruct our investigation." He looked around the room. "The question now is what we do with the nurse." Havers shifted in his chair. "She admitted to intelligence activities under Richter's command. That makes her complicit, regardless of coercion." "She was a prisoner of her own command structure," Lawson countered. "Richter used medical personnel to violate the Geneva Conventions. She had no meaningful choice." Wallace spoke up. "Her testimony will be valuable. She can provide details about German intelligence methods, about how they used medical access to gather information. That intelligence could save lives." Andrews considered this. "Captain Lawson, you've spent the most time with her. What's your assessment?" Lawson chose his words carefully. "She's not a traitor. She was trapped in a system that forced her to choose between impossible options. She chose survival. I can't fault her for that." The room was silent for a long moment. Then Andrews nodded. "She'll remain in custody, but under revised status, cooperative witness rather than enemy combatant. We'll debrief her thoroughly and forward the intelligence through proper channels." He turned to Lawson. "You'll handle the debriefing. You've earned her trust, apparently." After the briefing ended, Lawson walked out into the night. The air was cooler now, carrying the smell of rain. He stood at the perimeter, looking out at the dark landscape. Behind him, the camp continued its rhythms, guards changing shifts, vehicles moving supplies, the constant low hum of war. He thought about Harris, about the nurse, about the word traitor, and how easily it could be applied when the truth was far more complicated. War demanded clarity, but humanity resisted it. June 28, 1944 arrived at 03:30 with clear skies, and the first hint of summer warmth. Lawson stood outside the command hut, unable to sleep despite exhaustion. The events of the previous day had left him restless, his mind turning over questions that had no clean answers. The nurse had been moved to a separate tent under light security. The change in her status had sparked quiet controversy in the camp. Some soldiers understood the distinction between enemy combatant and coerced participant. Others saw only a German uniform and the complications that came with mercy. Lawson walked to her tent. The guard outside nodded and stepped aside. Inside, the nurse sat on a field cot, her hands free, her posture less rigid than before. She looked up as he entered. "You didn't sleep?" she observed. Her English was accented but clear. "Neither did you," Lawson replied. He pulled over a wooden crate and sat. "I need to ask you more questions. About Richter, about the intelligence operations, about what you saw and heard." She nodded. "I know, I'm ready." They talked for 2 hours. She described Richter's methods, how he exploited medical access to gather tactical information, how he threatened medical staff who resisted, how he justified violations of the Geneva Conventions as military necessity. She provided names, locations, and details about the intelligence network that operated within the German Medical Corps. Lawson took notes, filling page after page in his field notebook. The information would be valuable. Wallace had been right about that. But as he listened, he also heard something else: the cost of surviving in a system designed to break moral clarity. "Will you live with this decision?" she asked suddenly, interrupting her own account. Lawson looked up. "Which decision?" "The one you made about me, to believe me, to give me a chance." Her eyes held his. "Will you regret it?" He considered the question. "I don't know," he said honestly. "But I'd regret not trying to understand the truth more." She nodded slowly. "That's more than most would say." Outside, dawn began to lighten the sky. The camp stirred to life. Another day of war, Lawson thought. Another set of impossible choices. But this one, at least, he could live with. By 05, the decision had been formalized. Colonel Andrews issued written orders. The nurse would remain in custody under cooperative witness status. She would provide full debriefing on German medical intelligence operations. Upon completion, her case would be forwarded to higher command for final disposition. The orders also addressed Harris. He would be transported to a rear area facility for court-martial proceedings. The charges were explicit: providing intelligence to the enemy, compromising operational security, and attempted obstruction of military justice. The evidence was overwhelming. His service record would show a discharge under dishonorable conditions, assuming he avoided a death sentence. Lawson watched as Harris was loaded into a transport truck. The former medic moved slowly, his injuries still visible, his expression hollow. As the truck pulled away, Lawson felt no satisfaction, only the weight of necessity. The nurse stood near the perimeter, accompanied by Sergeant Wallace. She had been allowed outside for the first time since her capture. The morning sun caught her face, and Lawson saw her close her eyes, absorbing the warmth and light. For a moment, she looked almost peaceful. "What happens now?" Wallace asked, approaching Lawson. "We document everything she tells us," Lawson replied. "Then we send it up the chain and hope someone knows what to do with it." Wallace nodded. "She's been cooperative, more than I expected." "She wants to survive," Lawson said. "And maybe she wants some kind of redemption. I don't blame her for either." The debriefing sessions continued throughout the day. The nurse provided detailed accounts of Richter's operations, identifying other medical personnel who had been coerced into intelligence work describing the networks that connected medical units to German intelligence services. The information was specific, verifiable, and valuable. By evening, Wallace had compiled a 30-page report. He handed it to Lawson for review. "This changes how we think about medical captures," Wallace said. "If the Germans were using medical personnel this systematically, we need new protocols." Lawson read through the report, recognizing the nurse's words translated into military terminology. It was thorough, professional, and devastating in its implications. The Germans had turned medicine into espionage, healing into intelligence gathering, and they had done it by exploiting the very people who had sworn to save lives. "Send it through," Lawson said finally. "Mark it urgent." June 28, 1944, moved toward its close. By 09:02, the camp had resumed its normal operational rhythm. Prisoners were processed, supplies were distributed, and patrols maintained perimeter security. The disruption caused by Harris's betrayal and the nurse's interrogation had been absorbed into the larger machinery of war. But for Lawson, the day carried a different weight. He stood near the post where the nurse had first been tied, the sign reading "Traitor," now discarded in a refuse pile. The wood looked ordinary now, stripped of its accusatory power, just a board, charcoal marks fading in the sun. The nurse was scheduled to depart the following morning. She would be transferred to a rear area intelligence facility for additional debriefing and eventual repatriation processing. Her future remained uncertain: prisoner exchange, post-war disposition, or something else entirely. The war would decide, as it decided everything. Lawson had arranged a final meeting. He found her in the tent, packing the few belongings she had been allowed: a change of clothes, a small medical kit, a photograph she said was of her family. She looked up as he entered. "I wanted to thank you," she said before he could speak, "for listening, for seeing me as more than just an enemy." Lawson shook his head. "I did my job. I tried to find the truth." "Many wouldn't have tried," she replied. "Many would have accepted the easy answer, the sign, the uniform, the assumption of guilt." She paused. "You gave me back something I thought I'd lost." "What's that?" "The possibility of being understood." They stood in silence for a moment. Outside, the sounds of the camp continued: vehicles, voices, the constant background noise of military operation. Inside, a different kind of understanding passed between them. "I don't know what will happen to you," Lawson said finally, "but I'll make sure your testimony reaches the right people. What you've told us about Richter, about the intelligence operations, it matters." She nodded. "I hope it helps someone. I hope it makes a difference." Lawson left the tent, feeling the weight of the last 2 days settle into his memory. The nurse, Harris, the word traitor, all of it had challenged his assumptions about clarity in war. He had learned something. Truth was rarely simple, and justice even less so. June 30th, 1944, arrived with heavy clouds and the promise of rain. The camp had returned to its established routine. New prisoners arrived daily from forward positions as Allied forces pushed deeper into Normandy. The processing continued, the machinery of war grinding forward with mechanical efficiency. Captain Lawson stood at the perimeter where the post remained, empty now, but still standing. He had not ordered its removal. Something about leaving it there felt necessary, a physical reminder of how quickly judgment could be rendered, and how difficult truth could be to establish. The nurse had departed 2 days earlier, transported under guard to a facility near Kernin. Lawson had received confirmation of her arrival and the beginning of additional debriefing. The intelligence she provided was being analysed. cross-referenced with other sources, incorporated into the larger understanding of German operations. Harris's court-martial had been scheduled. The evidence was overwhelming, the outcome predictable. Lawson had been notified that he would be called to testify. He would describe the investigation, the discovery of Harris's betrayal, the circumstances that led to his capture. The testimony would be factual, precise, and devastating. Colonel Andrews found him at the perimeter. "You're thinking about her," Andrews said. It was not a question. "About both of them," Lawson replied. "About how thin the line is between survival and betrayal." Andrews nodded. "War doesn't give us the luxury of philosophical certainty. We make decisions with incomplete information and live with the consequences." "Harris thought he was making the right choice," Lawson said. "The nurse thought she had no choice at all. Where does that leave us?" "Trying to do better next time," Andrews said. "That's all we can do." They stood together in silence, watching the camp operate around them. Soldiers moved with purpose, vehicles transported supplies, guards maintained their posts. The war continued, indifferent to individual struggles with conscience and consequence. Lawson thought about the nurse's final question. "Will you live with this decision?" He still didn't have a complete answer, but he knew he had tried to find truth in a situation designed to resist it. He had questioned assumptions, listened to testimony that challenged easy narratives, and made choices based on evidence rather than prejudice. That, he thought, was the best he could offer. In war, perhaps it was enough. July 5, 1944, marked 1 week since the nurse's departure. Allied forces advanced across Normandy. Caen under siege, American units pushing towards Saint-Lô. The beachhead had consolidated into sustained offensive operations. Captain Lawson received communication from the intelligence facility. Subject's testimony corroborated through independent sources. Intelligence value rated high. Recommend continued cooperation status. He read it twice, then filed it with the case documentation. The nurse's account, Richter, the systematic exploitation of medical personnel, the coercion, had been verified. Truth, when finally established, rarely felt triumphant. It simply felt necessary. Harris's court-martial had concluded. Dishonorable discharge, 10 years military imprisonment, severe but not capital. Some recognition that coercion came in many forms. Lawson had testified without embellishment. The tribunal decided based on evidence and precedent. Reflecting on those 2 days in late June, Lawson recognized what training had not prepared him for. The enemy was rarely simple, and neither was justice. People made choices constrained by circumstances beyond their control. Systems created pressures that bent moral clarity beyond recognition. The nurse and Harris had both faced impossible choices. Both tried to survive. The difference lay in how they responded when those choices came to light. War demanded simplicity, friend and enemy, loyal and traitorous, right and wrong, but humanity resisted such categories. Lawson walked to the perimeter looking at the empty post. He thought about the sign, Traitor, and how inadequate that word had been. His mission had not been just to fight the enemy, but to preserve something harder. Commitment to truth when inconvenient, recognition of humanity even in enemy uniforms, willingness to see beyond easy answers. The war would continue. He would face other moral complications, other moments where clarity dissolved into ambiguity. But this case had taught him that justice in war required more than following orders. It required courage to question, investigate, and accept that sometimes the right answer was the most difficult to reach. The post remained standing, a silent witness. Lawson left it there, a reminder that judgment should never come easily, and truth was worth the effort. The file closed without additional comment. The numbers had been absorbed into the larger record. But they represented a moment when the machinery of war paused long enough for humanity to reassert itself.